This is Lecture 2 in the series Introduction to Pro-Capitalist Macroeconomics.
Well, I'd like to begin by briefly reminding you where we left off. I made the point that the first thing to keep in mind in connection with Say's law, the proposition that supply creates its own demand, is that Say's law refers to real demand, not monetary demand. Monetary demand is the spending of money. That is determined by the quantity of money. The more money, the more spending. But real demand refers to what the monetary demand can actually buy, and that is determined by supply. We saw that more monetary demand by itself would not represent any greater real demand. It would merely raise prices. If the same supply came to market and more was spent to buy it, it would buy the same supply at higher prices. There would be no rise in real demand. The only way that a larger monetary demand can be a larger real demand is if and to the extent that there is more supply. So we saw more supply is necessary to more real demand. More monetary demand by itself is not sufficient. And going still further, we saw that even if monetary demand remains the same, if there's the same spending but there's more supply will result in lower prices. It will increase the buying power of the same money and the same spending. More supply creates more real demand by itself, just through reducing prices. So it's necessary and sufficient for more real demand. Now, in the light of that, I want to give you somewhat of an elaboration on Figure 2, which you have on page 3. Walter, now is the time. Thank you. All right. This is Figure 2 with the elaboration of the same material that appears under Figure 1. It's just an enlarged Figure 2. Here we have the volume of employment. So many people working. You could think of this as millions of full-time employees per year. The larger the number of employees, the greater the output, given the quantity and quality of equipment. This lower line, on which point B rests, represents the use of more and better machinery. Can you people see this? All right. Now, we saw that according to the consumptionists, an increase in production creates a problem of overproduction. They viewed demand as fixed and given. But in fact, consider how large a quantity of goods and services is any given amount of money, say $1 trillion or $1 billion. Let's work with a small number that we are more familiar with. How much goods and services can $1,000 buy? It depends on the prices of the goods. Well, this demand curve represents a given volume of spending corresponding to a given quantity of money. If there is so much money in the economic system, let's say we froze the quantity of money at $500 billion. That's the total quantity of money. Well, $500 billion would serve as the base for perhaps $1 trillion of total spending each year in the economic system. So let us say the total spending is $1 trillion, that's it. Well, what is going to determine how much the $1 trillion can buy? Prices. Well, now the question is, what's going to determine prices? See, let us say we have some existing price level right here. Call it price level 1. And that corresponds to this supply. We have the same quantity of money, the same volume of spending. Now, there are improvements in machinery. The same number of workers produce output B instead of output A. And now there's a larger supply, which I've labeled S prime, S prime. This is a larger supply. What has to happen for the larger supply to be bought? What has to happen to enable people to buy the larger supply? Prices just have to fall. If prices fall from P1 to this lower level, P2, the same money and the same spending will buy the larger output. Now, what kind of real demand does this same spending represent? It's a larger real demand. The same $1 trillion, initially the $1 trillion bought output A at the price P1. Now, the greater output B reduces prices to P2, and the $1 trillion buys the larger output B. Now, there is no limit, as I explained yesterday, to the quantity of goods and services people would potentially like to have. Well, what determines the goods and services that we actually can have? Our ability to produce. And the ability to produce determines how much our money can buy. It's production and supply which determine how much we are actually capable of demanding. Now, the basic way that they do it is by operating to reduce prices and to expand the purchasing power of money. More production and supply enlarge, they create real demand by reducing prices and enabling any given quantity of money and volume of spending to buy more and more. More production and supply reduce prices and enable any given quantity of money and volume of spending to buy more and more. So now, if methods of production improve, if the same number of workers doing the same work can produce the larger output B rather than the smaller output A, if we have freedom of competition and prices can fall, is there any problem of an overproduction? No, the market will take all that we're able to produce and more. Suppose more people want to go to work. Suppose the number of people who wish to work rises from F to G. And with the same machinery, they produce output B. Is there any difficulty of finding a market for the output of a larger number of workers if prices and wages can fall to allow whatever the volume of spending is to buy more? There is no, ask yourself, how many workers can be employed by $1 billion? Depends on wages. And the output of those workers, whatever their output is, how much output can be purchased by $1.1 billion? Depends on the prices. Well, imagine that we had an economic system in which total payrolls in the whole economy were $1 billion, and total spending to buy the output was $1.1 billion. Well, how much labor could be employed and how much output could be purchased? All that would determine it under freedom of competition is however many workers there were who wanted to work and however much they could produce. There's no limit to employment or to the demand for goods except the number of people able and willing to work. If they're free to bid down wages per worker, whatever payrolls are, they can employ everyone who wants to work. Whatever the spending for goods is, it can buy whatever the output is at the appropriate level of prices. Now, to bring the discussion, elaborate it one step further, Walter, I could use you again. Sorry. All right, here is the identical diagram that we have over here with one elaboration. I've showed the effects of an increase in the quantity of money and volume of spending. You see, if we in fact have substantial increases in production, and if we had a commodity money such as gold or silver, then in fact it would almost certainly be the case that there will be some increase in the quantity of that particular commodity which constitutes the money. So the quantity of money, in fact, will increase as a byproduct of the increase in production, and the total volume of spending will increase too. And that is shown by a higher nominal demand curve. If we have more money, then the total spending will be larger than with less money. But nothing crucial depends on having the larger quantity of money. And observe, the only way that more production results in more total spending is insofar as there happens to be more production of the money itself. Suppose we have improvements in the production of television sets, automobiles, shoes, whatever. Those improvements in and of themselves do not operate to increase total spending in the economic system. Total spending in the economic system depends on the quantity of money. Now, if there are substantial improvements in auto production, television production, etc., well, technology spreads into all areas. It would be likely that there would be some indirect impact on gold mining, and so in fact we should also realize that the quantity of gold will tend to rise and there will be more spending of money. But what makes the greater spending of money, even of gold money, what allows it to represent a larger real demand is only insofar as there is a greater supply of ordinary commodities. Now, let me say, as a methodological point, I have found perhaps the most fruitful assumption that can be made in thinking about economic problems is to assume that the quantity of money and the volume of spending to buy goods is constant. If you want to think about economic problems, I think an indispensable starting point is to treat the quantity of money and the spending for goods as a constant, and carry out your reasoning in that context, and then when you've done that, you can add back in the fact, well, the quantity of money will probably increase too. Otherwise, I don't think you can think about economics. You have to, if you hold the quantity of money constant, you're putting off to the side a huge complexity of problems. You radically simplify what you have to think about. And then you can bring it back in. All right, well now, let us turn to the other major referent of Say's law, the fact that it refers to aggregate, that means total, economy-wide demand. Say's law, when it says supply creates demand, it doesn't mean that more supply in a particular industry will necessarily create more demand either in terms of money or in real terms for the product of that particular industry. Say's law holds more supply in the economy as a whole creates equivalently more real demand in the economy as a whole. And the greatest confusions in connection with Say's law arise from forgetting the fact that it refers to the economy as a whole. And for that reason, I deliberately choose a case which I'll go over with you at the risk of possible unnecessary repetition, because I spell it out in great detail in the supplement. I deliberately want to choose a case which on the face of it appears to flatly contradict Say's law. I want a case in which there is an increase in the supply of something which is not very greatly desired, and the consequence of which will be that the producers of that product end up taking in less, both in money and in goods, than they did before they increased their production. So I assume we have a good like potatoes, which all of us already have pretty much all we want. If we produced extra potatoes, probably the best we could do with them is feed them to pigs. Now, Here we have a good. I'm assuming there'll be an increase in the supply of potatoes. For the sake of convenience, a nice, neat doubling. It's a simple number to work with. And because additional potatoes are not strongly desired, the value of potatoes is going to fall very sharply. Now first, we'll run this through on the assumption of a barter economy. We'll put money on the side altogether. We'll assume that people are exchanging goods for goods. And this was the common assumption of the classical economists when they propounded Say's law. After we have looked at things in the conditions of a barter economy, we'll then review the same circumstances in a monetary economy. All right, so here we are. The potato growers have discovered a major new improvement in methods of production. Let's say there has been some bug up to now consuming half the potato crop, and someone discovers a very simple way of eliminating this bug, and now the supply of potatoes can be doubled each year with the same labor applied to their production. So here we are. The potato growers come to the market with twice the supply of potatoes. But people don't want twice the supply of potatoes very much. So what happens is the exchange value of a bushel of potatoes falls to 1/3. I pick 1/3 simply because it's the closest integer fraction to a half that will result in the potato growers receiving less of other people's goods than they used to. So here are the potato growers. They used to exchange a certain quantity of potatoes for a certain quantity of shoes, of shirts, of nails, etc. And now the quantity of shoes that they can obtain for a unit of potatoes is 1/3 what it used to be. And of shirts, 1/3 what it used to be. Well, the potato growers have twice the potatoes. They're getting 1/3 the amount per bushel. So altogether, they're taking in 2/3 of what they used to take in. The real demand for potatoes, expressed in terms of other goods, has actually fallen. It's only 2/3 of what it used to be. The potato growers receive 2/3 the shoes, shirts, etc. that they used to receive. Well, this appears to be a flat contradiction of Say's law. Here we are, the potato growers have been to school, they read about Say's law, and they say, look, you told us supply creates its own demand. Well, we've certainly got the extra supply, and look what's happened to our demand. It's less, not more. What are you armchair economists talking about? Well, what we have to do now is realize that Say's law does not refer to a particular industry, but to the economy as a whole. The demand for potatoes in terms of other goods has fallen by 1/3. The shoe producers give 1/3 fewer shoes for the potatoes. The shirt producers 1/3 fewer shirts. But now we have to ask, well, what do the shoe producers do with the shoes they no longer give to the potato growers? What do the shirt producers do with the shirts they no longer give to the potato growers? Well, now they can exchange these things among themselves. The shoe producers have more means of obtaining goods other than potatoes. The producers of all other goods have more means of obtaining other goods. The shoe producers have shoes left over to buy shirts. The shirt producers have shirts left over to buy more shoes. Well, observe, the other goods, that means all goods other than potatoes, the other goods' demand for potatoes has fallen by 1/3. There's 1/3 less of goods other than potatoes given for potatoes. But what has happened to the other goods' demand for other goods? That's equivalently increased. So up to this point, it's even Steven. We have a wash. One component is the other goods' demand for potatoes. That's down by 1/3. The second element is the other goods' demand for other goods. That's up equivalently. Now what we have to realize is what has happened to the potato demand for other goods. Consider, in a barter economy, what is the currency that people use, in quotes, to go and buy their goods? Whatever they produce. Well, what has happened to the spending of potatoes for everything else? there's twice the potatoes being offered for everything else. Now, what we have to do is focus on three separate elements. There's the other goods demand for potatoes. That is down by 1/3. There's the other goods demand for other goods. That's up to just the same extent. And then there is the potato demand for other goods, which has doubled, precisely to the same extent as the increase in supply of potatoes. The potato growers offer double the potatoes. Now, if we add these three elements, we add the other goods demand for potatoes, minus 1/3. The other goods demand for other goods, plus the same amount. And the potato demand for other goods, the doubled potato demand for other goods. What is the sum of those three items? It's up by the extra potatoes. The aggregate demand in the economy as a whole has increased precisely to the extent of the additional supply of potatoes. Now, in a barter economy, if you really think about the nature of a barter economy, this is inescapable. In a barter economy, what does demand consist of? What does each person make his demand with? His own production. Well, now, in a barter economy, the only thing that can increase demand is an increase in production. If anybody comes with a larger supply of goods, what has happened to the total volume of goods being offered in the market? What's happened to the total volume of goods being spent? It's gone up. In a barter economy, demand and supply are really the same thing. Each person's supply is his demand. That's what he makes his demand with. The more the supply, the more the demand, by the very same stroke. Well, all that we have to do is realize that there can be this wrinkle that the producers of a particular good in increased supply may, as a result of their larger supply, which is not strongly desired, be confronted with a reduced offering of other people's goods to them. The potato growers have double the potatoes, but they may end up with less goods being offered to them. The demand for potatoes in terms of other goods may drop as a consequence of more potatoes. But then, to the same extent, the other goods demand for goods other than potatoes rises, and the net increase is the increase in the supply of potatoes. And I spell it out in black and white on page 5. I summarize the results at the bottom. And as a matter of fact, I think we can show Say's law virtually at the perceptual level. Let us say I represent the potato industry. And this one pen, imagine I had one for each and every one of you. This is my initial supply. And when this is my initial supply, each of you are offering me 3 units of your supply. So I'm receiving, let us say, 3 pages from Jim Konzak, 3 sheets of paper. Jim Konzak is exchanging 3 sheets of paper for my pen when I have only 1 pen. Now, my supply doubles. I have 2 pens. What I receive for 1 pen is no longer 3 sheets, but only 1 sheet. So how many sheets will I receive for the 2 pens from Jim Konzak? 2 sheets. Well, now Jim has 1 sheet left over. And each of you have 1 unit of yours left over. So what will you do with the 1 unit you each have left over that you no longer give me? You trade that among yourselves. Now, the reduction in the goods that I take in is precisely offset by the extra goods that each of you take in. And now what remains? Well, each of you also take in 2 of these instead of 1. If we count up everything that's present, I take in less from you, but you take in more from you, and you take in more from me. The more that you take in from me is the increase in aggregate real demand. My supply represents the increase in aggregate real demand. Now, we couldn't say that aggregate real demand has doubled because the supply of potatoes has doubled. Potatoes are, after all, small potatoes. All right. Well, let us say that the potato industry represents 0.1% of the economic system. And there is a doubling of supply in this one very minor industry, which represents 1/10 of the economy. Well, then, the doubling of supply of potatoes will represent an increase in economy-wide aggregate demand of 0.1%. The increase in aggregate demand will be equal to the increase in the supply of potatoes, but we wouldn't say that economy-wide aggregate demand had doubled. The potato demand has doubled, but the economy-wide aggregate demand increases only to the extent that potatoes represent some part of the system. They're a minor part of the system. If the potato industry was 0.5% of the economy, then a doubling of the supply of potatoes would represent an increase of 0.5% in aggregate demand. All right, well, now let us run the same problem through in the context of a monetary economy. And we'll assume we have a fixed total expenditure of money to buy goods. There's just so much to buy potatoes and everything else in the entire economy. There's a fixed aggregate spending. All right, initially, potatoes have a certain price. And in fact, I spell it out in Table 1. Let's imagine initially the potato growers are receiving 10 units of money for their potatoes. And the producers of all other goods in the economic system are receiving 990 units of money. The total spending to buy goods of all descriptions combined is 1,000 units of money. All right, now the potato growers come with a doubled supply of potatoes, and the money price falls to 1/3. The money price of potatoes falls to 1/3. The potato growers have twice the supply. Well, twice the supply times 1/3 the price means the potato growers will take in 2/3 the money revenue they used to take in. They used to sell a given number of units for 10. Now they're selling twice the number of units for 6 2/3. So they are taking in 1/3 less money for their doubled production. But then we have to raise the question, well, what do people do with the money they no longer spend for potatoes? They'll spend it for something else. Well, in Table 1, under Roman numeral 2, I show doubling of potatoes. Price equals 1/3. The revenue and income of the potato growers is now 6.67. 1/3 the price times twice the quantity is going to be 2/3 the revenue. The initial revenue was 10, now it's 6.67. But what's happened to revenue and income in the rest of the economy outside of potato growing? Well, now that's greater. That's 993 1/3. All right, the potato growers have a loss in money, revenue, and income. The rest of the economic system has an equivalent gain. Once again, up to this point, we have a washout. The potato growers are faced with a lesser monetary demand. The rest of the economy has an equivalently greater monetary demand. But now we have to ask, what has happened to the buying power of the total monetary demand? The total monetary demand is 1,000. What does this 1,000 now buy? It buys all that it used to buy plus the doubled potatoes. So what has happened to this 1,000 of monetary demand in terms of its character as a real demand? The real demand has increased The 1,000 of monetary demand now represents a larger real demand. To what extent? To the extent of the increase in the supply of potatoes. 1,000 of money now buys all that it used to buy, plus the extra potatoes. Now, if the extra potatoes, as I say, represent 0.1% more total supply, if we say the aggregate supply in the economy as a whole has increased 0.1% by virtue of the doubling of potatoes, well, that represents the increase in real demand. That will represent the extent to which the average of prices falls. If you look back to page 1, where we have a formula for the price level, suppose in the numerator we have 1,000. 1,000 is the spending to buy consumers' goods. 1,000 is the spending to buy potatoes and everything else. And now the supply of goods has increased to the extent of the doubling of potatoes. And we enter into the denominator 1.001. The total supply of goods has increased 0.1% by virtue of the doubling of potatoes. Well, this 1,000 of spending will buy the 0.1% larger aggregate supply. The general price level will be a little bit lower. The price of potatoes is sharply lower. The price of potatoes is down to 1/3. But other prices, by implication, have risen a little bit. The supply of things other than potatoes has not increased, but there is some extra spending for things other than potatoes. All right, well, we have once again an increase in aggregate economy-wide real demand precisely equal to the increase in the supply of potatoes. It's perfectly true we can have industries which, when they increase their supply, they suffer as a result of increasing their supply. They are faced with less spending in money, and the less money represents less real demand too. That's perfectly possible. It happens often for individual industries. But we're looking at the economic system as a whole. And in the economic system as a whole, it is still true, and always is true, that an increase in supply results in an increase in economy-wide demand, in economy-wide aggregate demand. And let me point out already at this level, it should be clear that the gains have to outweigh the losses. The potato growers have a loss. Their loss is measured by the reduction in revenue and income that they receive. But the revenue and income of the rest of the economy is up to the same extent, right? That's already even. Where is there an implied net gain? There's the increase in buying power based on the increase in supply of potatoes. You're right to say the gain is that people eat more potatoes. The gain, the potato growers have less revenue and income. Other producers have more revenue and income. Their gain offsets the potato growers' loss. And then over and above this balancing of gains and losses, the net gain is there's more potatoes and everyone's buying power has increased. The buying power of the average dollar has increased. Now, you may say, well, what about the potato growers? This is still pretty bad for the potato growers. That's true. So now we have to carry the analysis further and look at what is going to happen to the potato growers in this sort of situation. Here we are. The potato growers are suffering. Their revenue and income is 2/3 what it used to be. But at the same time, there is some modest improvement in the revenue and income of people in other industries. Notice revenue and income in the rest of the economy has risen from $9.90 to $9.33.33, as the potato growers' revenue and income has fallen from $10 to 6.67. Well, what will some potato growers do? They'll get out of potato growing. They'll move into some of the other industries. Now, as some potato growers start to leave potato growing, what happens to the output of potatoes and what happens to the price of potatoes? The output will be cut back, the price will rise. What will happen to the income of those who remain in potato growing? That will start to recover. By the same token, as ex-potato growers move into other industries which have experienced some premium income, what happens to the initial rise in income in the other industries? As ex-potato growers move into becoming cab drivers, construction workers, whatever, what happens to income in those fields where people were spending more money? They will start to come down. All right, the income of the potato growers begins to recover. The premium income in other lines begins to evaporate. Now, what we have to ask is, if it's the case that the potato growers can permanently grow potatoes twice as efficiently as they used to, it's just as easy now for them to grow 2 bushels as it used to be to grow 1. Now we have to ask, what kind of price of potatoes would be required so that whoever remained in potato growing would receive as much revenue and income as he used to before the whole thing started? Half the price. If the price of potatoes can get up from 1/3 of its initial level to 1/2 of its initial level, then whoever remains in potato growing earns just as much revenue and income as he used to earn. All right, well, there has to be some reduction in the number of potato growers. There's some production of potatoes, less than double, but more than the initial amount, will result in a price of potatoes of 1/2. Double the production of potatoes means a price of potatoes of 1/3. Some production of potatoes less than double, but more than what the production was to begin with, more than 1, will raise the price of potatoes from 1/3 up to 1/2. Well, for the sake of convenience of arithmetic, let us assume that if the supply of potatoes is cut from double to 3/2, from double to 1.5, that will raise the price from 1/3 to 1/2. If the supply of potatoes can be cut back from double to 1.5 times, 1.5 the output of potatoes will sell at half the price. Double the supply sells at 1/3 the price. Now, the number could be anything. We could say perhaps you'd have to cut the supply of potatoes back from double to 1.069. But it's complicated enough, and nothing depends on the number. We want some number to work with to make it concrete, but we can take an easy number. So we'll assume that the production of potatoes will now fall from double to 3/2. When that happens, the price of potatoes rises from 1/3 its initial price to 1/2. At that point, whoever remains in potato growing receives as good a revenue and income as he did before the whole thing started. And people who used to be potato growers have now relocated in other lines. They can receive as good an income as they used to have. And the people who were in the other lines from the beginning, they no longer have a premium income. And now that is where we are in condition 3 in table 1, which I describe as a new equilibrium. Quantity of potatoes is 3/2. The price of potatoes is 1/2. Well, how many potato growers do we need to produce 3/2 the output if each grower is twice as efficient? 3/4. If we have 3/4 the potato growers, each producing double, that gives a potato industry producing 3/2. So what has to happen is the number of potato growers has to be cut to 3/4. When we have 3/4 the potato growers producing 3/2, the price of potatoes will be 1/2. Those who remain in potato growing earn as good an income as they did before. Those who used to be potato growers can earn as good an income as they did before. And the people in the rest of the system who are never potato growers, they earn the same income they did initially. Well, what is the net economic difference? Well, there's an increase in supply of other goods, that's part of it, but observe, how much money does the average person spend to buy potatoes now? He's paying a price of half, and he's buying a quantity of 1.5. He's paying half the price for 1.5 times the quantity. The expenditure for potatoes is 3/4. The expenditure that the average person makes for potatoes is 3/4 what he used to make. He's buying 1.5 times the quantity at half the price. So he's spending 3/4. What is he doing with the money that he no longer spends for potatoes? It's being spent on other goods, and that would be true if it were saved too. It's spent on other goods. Now, what has happened to the physical ability to produce other goods? Increased by virtue of what? By the labor released from potato growing. The position of the average person in the economic system is he now gets 1.5 times the potatoes for 3/4 the spending. He pays half the price. 1/4 of the money he used to spend on potatoes he has available to buy other things, which physically can be produced by virtue of labor no longer needed in potato growing. What is the position of the remaining potato grower? Is the potato grower just as well off as he used to be? He's better off too. The remaining potato grower gets his potatoes more easily and can afford more of other things. Those who used to be potato growers get their potatoes more easily and can afford more of other things. The net effect is that by virtue of this improvement, everyone is enabled to get more potatoes plus more of other things. Once this adjustment has been made, once some potato growers have left, everyone in the economic system ends up benefiting from this improvement, including the potato growers who initially lost by it. Now, those of you who were here 2 years ago, you may recall the discussion of competition that I had in which I said, in the long run, there are no genuine losers. Well, this is the theoretical basis of it. Initially, competition and an improvement in production can make people in a particular area lose. But when the process of adjustment occurs, everybody, including those who initially lost by it, end up gaining. Now, if we can hold in mind what we've established up to now, it's possible to perceive in this discussion a further major principle. What we've discussed is a process of adjustment. Potato growing has had to be cut back, other production expanded. When we reach the new equilibrium, condition 3, everybody is gaining. In condition 3, potato production has been cut back from double to 1.5. The production of other things has been expanded. Let us focus for a moment on condition 3 compared with condition 2. In condition 3, in table 1, potato production has been scaled back from double to 1.5. And what's happened to the production of other things? That's been increased. All right, now, let us adopt condition 3 as a standard for appraising condition 2. We want to adopt this new equilibrium, condition 3, where everything has worked out as it properly should. where potato production is 3/2 instead of double, where there's been an increase in the production of other things by virtue of the release of labor from potato growing. We want to use condition 3 as a mental standard for appraising condition 2. If we do that, it is correct then to say that in condition 2, we had an overproduction of potatoes. We didn't want double of potatoes. Doubling of potatoes was too much of an increase of potatoes. We wanted 1.5. So we could say correctly, there has been an overproduction of potatoes. But by the same token, what must we say of the production of things other than potatoes in condition 2? There has been a precisely corresponding underproduction. The production of things other than potatoes has, in condition 2, not come up to the point where we wish it to come up. We get the ability to produce twice the number of potatoes. Well, we don't have to produce twice the number of potatoes. You're not frozen in the potato fields and just having to stay there and produce more and more potatoes. You have to keep in mind that whenever we have the ability to produce anything more efficiently, we have an option as to how to apply that ability. We do not have to apply that ability to produce more of the particular thing where we've become more efficient. We might, but we don't have to. The fact that we can produce potatoes twice as efficiently doesn't mean that we should use that improvement, in fact, to produce twice the potatoes. Conceivably, we might want to produce no more potatoes and produce the same potatoes with half the labor. Would that be beneficial? What would be the benefit? We have half the labor that used to produce potatoes released to produce more of something else. Well, every improvement gives us the ability to increase the production of practically anything. Wherever an improvement occurs, we could cut back the labor in that line and increase production somewhere else. Now, what happens is when there are improvements in production which are concentrated in particular lines, as in this potato example, it may be that the initial effect is we are using the benefit of our improved efficiency too heavily in that line. To get the real benefit, we don't want to expand that line so heavily. We should expand that line more moderately or not at all, and instead expand other lines. But if the initial expansion is confined to that line, well, then it's correct to say this line is overproducing, but at the very same time, to the very same extent, there is a precisely equivalent underproduction elsewhere. Potatoes are overproduced so long as they're doubled rather than increased 1.5. But the production of other things where people are spending the money they no longer spend for potatoes, there is an underproduction. Now, this is a very major principle of classical economics. The classical economists were very firm on the point. You can have a partial overproduction, a relative overproduction. You could have overproduction in some industries. In fact, theoretically, up to half of the economic system could be overproducing. But to exactly the same extent, the rest of the economic system is equivalently underproducing. If we could increase our ability to produce, let me put it to you this way. Suppose by some miracle we could find a way to double the production of everything starting tomorrow morning. We could produce double the matches and double the swimming pools and luxury automobiles, hamburgers, everything. Suppose that we began by, in fact, producing double of everything. Now, double of everything, if we could produce double, that would be equivalent to doubling our incomes. If we could double production per person, as I'll explain in detail when we get to wages, if we could double production per person, that would be equivalent to doubling our incomes. Well, now imagine initially you're making $20,000 a year, and now you've got an income of $40,000 a year. If your income were $40,000 a year, would you want to buy double of each and every good that you now buy? How would your pattern of consumption be affected? There are some things which you would consume little or no more of, others that you might consume less of, but those things that you presently regard as luxuries, you'd consume much, much more of. Well, now, if we started by doubling the production of everything, we would be radically overproducing the necessities, but radically underproducing the luxuries. What we would want, if we had the ability to double our production, we wouldn't want to double each and every good or each and every industry. The relative size of the different industries would have to undergo a major change. We would want to sharply increase the things we now consider luxury goods. So long as they were merely doubling, they'd be underproducing. We would want a very sharp increase in the production of high-quality automobiles, swimming pools, larger homes, bigger television sets, yachts, private planes, whatever. If the production of these things merely doubled, they would be radically underproducing, at the same time that if the production of bread doubles, it would be overproducing. Well, you see, you can have relative partial overproduction confined to certain industries, but never can you have overproduction in the economic system as a whole. And that I consider one of the really major contributions of the British classical economists. And let me point out that in many cases in which an individual industry finds itself relatively overproducing, the problem is not that people are sated with its particular good. Sometimes people could be actually sated with a good. I think we're at the point of satiety with table salt. No one is waiting for any price reduction to use more table salt. So we are sated with that, perhaps bread, potatoes. But most other goods we're very, very far from sated with. I think if people had the means, and you allow for upgrading of quality, they could easily want an automobile industry 5 or 10 times its present size that would be producing the higher quality cars in much greater number and even better than we now have. So nevertheless, the auto industry could find itself in a problem of relative overproduction, even though the desire for automobiles is far from sated. Now, the way that can happen, let us suppose that all that occurred was the automobile industry in isolation became twice as efficient. It became possible to produce the same cars that are now produced at half the cost and sell them at half the price. Imagine that that could happen. All right, here we are. We earn a certain income, and now the price of automobiles is halved. Well, if we are normally spending just 10% of our income in purchasing automobiles, a halving of the price of automobiles is equivalent to a 5% rise in our income. Now, even though we would easily like to double or triple our consumption of automobiles, if our income goes up the equivalent merely of 5%, would that be sufficient to make us want to double our consumption of automobiles? How much more, if automobiles were offered to us at half the price, even though we want more automobiles, what do you think would happen to the spending for automobiles? It would sharply drop. If our income is being increased only 5%, well, we may want some improvement in automobile transportation, but it's very unlikely that we'll devote the entire improvement to auto transportation. If we could get automobiles cheaper, we'd want to use some of the savings from automobiles to buy better furniture or better clothing or whatever. What would be required to enable us to satisfy our desire, which is there at least potentially, for double the supply of automobiles? All right, you could say double wages, doubled real income. What would be required is suppose the price of housing and furniture and clothing and food could be cut, so that now, imagine the price of everything could be cut in half. Now what has happened to the buying power of our income? Now it's doubled. Now we're in a position where we could afford double the supply of automobiles. You see, if our real income could double, then we very well might want double the supply of automobiles. But if all that happens is a doubling of efficiency in automobiles, well, that by itself represents perhaps a 5% increase in real income. We wouldn't want to use that modest increase in real income and concentrate it all in automobiles. So if all that happened was the auto industry doubled its efficiency, the auto industry would be relatively overproducing until all the other major industries could sufficiently increase their ability to produce. At that point, we'd want double the production of automobiles. You see, very, very often, the problem, and usually I would say, when an individual industry has a problem of overproduction, it's not because the desire for its product is sated, it's because there hasn't been enough of an improvement in production in other industries. All right, well, this too is something that the classical economists were very well aware of. Now, I'd like to take a few minutes to cash in on this discussion a little bit further. What makes it possible for people to hold confusions on the effect of more production, to believe the nonsense that depressions can be caused by overproduction, is the fallacy of composition, namely the error of arbitrarily generalizing from the conditions of a particular case to a system as a whole. An example of the fallacy of composition in physics is the notion that you can weigh the universe. You can weigh something in the universe, you can't weigh the universe. Well, in economics, the main case where the fallacy of composition arises is a particular individual industry can overproduce, but there's always equivalent corresponding underproduction. If any particular industry relatively overproduces, its profitability will fall. It could be wiped out. For example, our potato growers I show in Table 2. It's Table 1 modified to include costs and profits. When potato production is doubled and the price of potatoes falls to a third and the revenues fall to 6.67, the potato industry is running at a financial loss. And it is running at a loss because it's relatively overproducing. Now, at the same time, the profitability of the rest of the economic system taken together is equivalently greater. But any particular industry, any industry at any one time, could be in the position of relatively overproducing. It is possible for any given industry at some time or other to be relatively overproducing and to suffer a loss as a result. Now, what happens in a depression, practically all businesses are suffering losses. And what do they blame it on? That they're all overproducing. Well, that is nonsensical. What they're doing is overgeneralizing. They're suffering losses, but the explanation of their losses cannot possibly be that they're overproducing. In fact, the level of production and the growth of production is strictly neutral with regard to the general profitability of business. The growth of production can lower the profits of some industries and correspondingly raise the profits of other industries if it's not taking place in proper balance. But the increase in production never operates on the general rate of profit. And the way you can see that is from Table 2. Suppose we had an economic system in which every year there is 1,000 spent to buy products. We're assuming a simplified condition here each company owns its own sources of materials and produces its own equipment. So the only sales revenues are from consumers. The only cost is to pay wages. The company produces its own materials, equipment, etc., so it doesn't buy those things. All right, suppose we had an economy in which in every year total spending to buy products was 1,000 and total spending to pay wages was 800. Well, then sales revenues are 1,000, costs would be 800. Monetary profit would be 200. Now, suppose production doubles. If the sales revenue are still 1,000 and the total wages paid are still 800, what is profit? If we have the same sales revenues and the same total wage costs, what will profit be? What will total profit be? It'll be the same. If production increases, the average selling price falls, the average unit cost falls, but the increase in production and the fall in prices has no effect on the general rate of profit. The increase in production is neutral with respect to the general rate of profit. It could lower the profits of particular industries that relatively overproduce, but at the same time it raises the rate of profit of industries that relatively underproduce. This is a first approximation. Hopefully there'll be time to go into profit in some detail, but as a first rough approximation, you could say that the rate of profit depends on the difference between the spending to buy the product, in this case consumption, and the wages paid in producing it. The total profit is the consumer spending to buy the product minus the wages paid in producing it. The level of production, the growth of production, does not affect the general profitability. One final major implication: falling prices that result from increasing production are not deflation. Falling prices that result from increasing production are not deflation. Now, the way the financial press and practically the whole economics profession, and even some friends of mine, use the term deflation and inflation is as a synonym for falling or rising prices. You'll hear, well, deflation is falling prices, inflation is rising prices. I can think of no error more disastrous. Increases in production cause falling prices. But when you say that that is deflation, deflation carries with it a package of other things besides the fall in prices. When there is deflation, debtors are unable to repay their debts, or it's certainly more difficult for them to do so. The nominal rate of profit, the dollars and cents rate of profit, is reduced or eliminated. That does not happen as the result of more production. You see, we have falling prices. One possible cause is more production. That will do it. But there's another possible cause, which is less money and spending. That will do it. Now, when prices fall because of more production, there is no negative effect on the rate of profit. If sales revenues are the same and wage payments are the same, profits are the same. It doesn't matter how big production is. But if there's less money and less spending, then sales revenues are going to fall, incomes in money fall, but what about debts that have been contracted in money? They stay the same and you can't pay them. Well, deflation, the inability to pay debt, bankruptcies and insolvencies, that is a consequence of less money and less spending, not the consequence of falling prices. It makes all the difference in the world why prices fall. If prices fall because of more production, that is of a totally different nature than if they fall because of less spending and less money. The term deflation, I think, should be reserved for a decrease in the quantity of money and or spending, not for falling prices. And the term inflation should be reserved for the genus an increase in the quantity of money and spending. I wouldn't say every increase, but an increase in the quantity of money more rapid than the increase in precious metals. You see, if you say that deflation means falling prices, you are accepting the whole overproduction doctrine, because then you're implying that improvements in production cause depressions. If you say falling prices are deflation, well, then you're saying falling prices mean people are going bankrupt, the rate of profit is being wiped out. Those are all parts of deflation. Falling prices resulting from increased production have no such consequence. All right, well, on page 9, I leave you with a couple of questions to test your powers of imagination and economic reasoning. Try to explain how the supply of potatoes can increase, and those who bring about the increase their revenues and incomes, even though the effect is to reduce the revenue and income of potato growers as a group. As I've presented it, you might think that there is a kind of injustice here to the potato growers. They increase their efficiency and they suffer, and you could raise the question, well, why should they do it? Well, in actual fact, to bring the analysis one step closer to the actual reality, we wouldn't wake up one morning with the whole industry doubling its production. It would start with some progressive minority of potato growers who would improve their efficiency. So imagine that 10% of the potato growers double their production. And the price falls disproportionately. We'll have 1.1 times the number of potatoes, but the price will be 0.8. So what happens to potato growers as a group? They lose. They're taking in now 8.8 collectively instead of 10. But what happens to that 10% of potato growers who are producing double at 0.8 the price? They take in 1.6 instead of 1. Now what's going on is those who introduce the improvement within an industry, they profit. That part of the industry which has not introduced the improvement bears the loss of the industry as a whole and a further loss equivalent to the profit of the improving element. Now it could work out, it wouldn't happen too often, but it would be possible that everyone who introduced the improvement would make a profit better than he used to, and all of the losses would be borne by those who hadn't introduced the improvement, and the people leaving the industry would be from among the ranks of those who hadn't introduced the improvement, and the last person adopting the improvement would come up to where he started at the very beginning. It could be that everyone who adopted the improvement actually improved his monetary position or at least didn't lose by it. But it needn't be that way, and if it isn't, it still works out in the long run, as I've described. Okay, well, I think I've said to you just about everything I wanted to say on Say's law, perhaps at 78 RPM when it should have been 33. We have some time left for a question period. I'll be glad to start taking them. Yes, Mr. Rohrig?
Comment on the difference between deflation and disinflation as it's used today, or as it should be used?
Would I comment on the difference between deflation and disinflation? Disinflation, you could say, represents a slowing down of inflation, a reduction in inflation. Deflation, I think, would require an actual reduction in total spending and or the quantity of money in existence. In 1929 to 1933, there was an actual deflation. I wouldn't say that what we have now is deflation. By all indications, the total volume of spending in the economy keeps rising, the quantity of money keeps rising. It just is not quite at the same rate that it was. Yes.
On page 1 of your handout, on the equations that you use down there in section 2, you have demand over supply. And then that's equal to the general consumer price level and the average money rate respectively.
Right.
Can you describe the units of each of those, each of the terms in the equations?
Would I describe the units in constituting supply?
Especially the units of supply, yes.
All right, the units of supply would embrace all of the goods in the economic system, from cigarettes to shoes to houses. Now, you could have a problem of saying, well, precisely how much is this? And you could have a difficulty in saying, well, what exactly is the unit? But I don't think it presents any problem for thought. I think there is no doubt. The question you have in mind is, how do we add up heterogeneous quantities, I think. All right. But now, if we compare the output that is being produced today compared with the output of 1785, I don't think that there is any difficulty whatever in saying that we are producing enormously more than we did in 1785, or that the United States produces more than Australia, or whatever. So I think the concept is clear. The precise way that we would measure it is subject to dispute. And what I am saying is that however we decide to measure the total supply, so long as we can think in terms of more or less of it, if there is a certain amount of spending of dollars and the supply increases and it increases by some amount, the price level is inversely proportionate to the increase in supply.
Regardless of how you quantify it.
Regardless of how we quantify it, just so long as we are consistent in our method. This gentleman in the red shirt, yes.
How does credit enter into the picture in a constant money supply? What would it do to it?
I'm sorry?
How does credit enter into the picture?
How does credit enter into the picture in a constant money supply? All right, well, there would be people who had lent money. It's the same position as how are their savings under a constant money supply. If you think out the implications of a constant money supply, there would be a tendency for the total amount of outstanding credit, the total value of stocks on the stock exchanges, the total aggregate value of the assets of business enterprises to stabilize. There would be credit. Let's say you have $5,000 of bonds. If you die, someone else will have $5,000 of bonds. If there is no increase in the quantity of money, there would be no tendency toward a constant growth in the monetary value of capital or savings or credit. There would be credit, there would be monetary capital, there would be savings, but no broad, no economy-wide monetary aggregate would tend to grow. The money value, imagine it this way. Suppose there had been no increase in the quantity of money since 1900. Imagine that back in 1900, we had taken a census of wealth. We went around and we enumerated the value of the assets of every business enterprise in the United States in 1900. And now we went back and did the same thing in 1985. Well, we would probably find some significant increase in the United States as a whole, to the extent that the United States economy today represents a larger share of the world's economy. We would find that the value of assets west of the Mississippi River had certainly risen, but we'd find that the value of assets of many industries like the railroads and agriculture had very sharply fallen. On a system-wide basis, and the system would have to be larger than just the United States, it would incorporate the industrialized world. On a system-wide basis, if the quantity of money is constant, the total monetary value of capital, of money income, would tend to stabilize. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be fixed forever. It would not show any constant tendency to grow. There could be a larger level of accumulated savings rather than a smaller level. For example, suppose in one period we had unstable government, people were afraid to save. Well, in that context, the total accumulated savings would be less than if we had a more stable environment in which savings were encouraged. But we wouldn't have continuous growth without more and more money. Real capital accumulation, the growth in physical assets, would take place through falling prices. When business firms earned the replacement funds on their existing machinery, the replacement funds would have a greater buying power than the initial funds, and they'd buy more and better assets. The gentleman in the blue.
I come from a potato-producing state that's in depression at the moment. That's
Yeah.
a fascinating example. And that led me to a question. If the theory is correct, doesn't it require that the increase in potatoes doesn't cause any decrease in any other good automatically? In other words, if you increase potatoes, you stop buying tractors. As I think it through, I think I could refute my own question, but isn't that a premise that you have to have?
Well, the potatoes are, that would be the same as we need fewer potato growers. You see, for purposes of simplification, which perhaps I should have spelled out, when I talk of the potato industry and the total labor employed to produce potatoes, I'd also be allowing for that amount of labor producing the tractors needed to grow the potatoes. If there's less demand for potatoes, if we don't need as many potatoes, well, perhaps we don't need as many tractors either. So then some of the tractor workers would have to move too. The gentleman in the far back.
You talked about how some potato growers might introduce better methods and make more money as a result. What happens in a similar case but a monopoly situation?
Well, when you say a monopoly situation, if you mean that someone adopts a better method and then the government prohibits people from competing with him.
No. Suppose there's only one industry in a given field, only one company.
Yeah. And they have a trade secret.
Yeah.
Okay. Well then, so long as they have the secret, they would earn a higher rate of profit, and the rest of the economic system, taken together, would earn a correspondingly lower rate of profit. And what would happen is the production of that particular item would be a little bit less than it would be if the secret were learned, and the production of other items would be somewhat greater. Let me get someone from this young lady right here.
Yes. What you're talking about has to do with overproduction not happening in the economy as a whole under free markets. Mm-hmm. But can it be that you can, with government intervention, you can have overproduction leading to depression?
No, even with government intervention, I would say you cannot have overproduction. The problem of government intervention is that it stops people from producing. You see, government intervention, let's say we have unemployment, and this, I'll go into this in detail starting Saturday. The problem is not that if the unemployed were employed, they would be overproducing. The problem really boils down to the government forcibly preventing the unemployed from producing. And no depression would ever be cured by less production. You see, I just indicated what wipes out business profitability and makes it difficult or impossible to repay debt is not the physical volume of production, but a reduction in the quantity of money and volume of spending. Picture in Table 2, suppose sales revenues fall from 1,000 to 700. Total sales revenues in the economy in Table 2 in the right-hand column fall from 1,000 to 700, but the volume of debt that is outstanding is only payable if sales revenues are 1,000. Now, how would matters be helped if the physical quantity of goods being sold for 700 were less? See, suppose the physical quantity of goods sold for the 700 were less. How would that help the financial ability to take in dollars to pay dollar debts? There's no more money. You'd still take in 700. You'd have a higher price, but correspondingly fewer units. You see, you owe so many dollars in debt, you have to take in so many dollars. The problem is the relationship between the number of dollars that can be taken in compared to the number of dollars that are owed. That is altogether independent of how much is produced. You could produce double or half, and if the relationship between the dollars taken in compared to the dollars owed is inappropriate, you still have the same trouble. You see, we produce 100 times more than people produced in 1819. Our depressions are not worse. Our depressions would not be helped if we went back to their level of production. We just have terrible impoverishment. The gentleman with the yellow shirt. Yes, you.
Yes. Is it common that an industry as a whole would decrease its profitability by an innovation, or would it be more usually the case that the innovator's increased profit would more than offset the competitor's loss in profitability?
All right, the question is, would it generally be the case that an industry as a whole would lose by virtue of an innovation? I would say that my guess is that it should work out about 50-50. An industry as a whole should lose about as many times as an industry as a whole gains. It depends on how much more of the industry's product is desired at a lower price. If we have an industry producing so-called necessities that people are already very well supplied with, improvements in industries of that kind will almost certainly reduce the profitability of the industry as a whole and reduce the number of people employed in that industry. If we have an improvement in a luxury good type industry, and now the improvement brings the product within reach of a mass market, whoever introduces the improvement will certainly have high profits, the industry as a whole can have high profits, and it will increase its employment. Improvements in agriculture generally tend to reduce the profitability of agriculture and the number of people employed there. Improvements, let's say, at least until the last year or so, in computers or television sets or videotape recorders, which are the things that open up to a mass market as the price goes down, they lead to more employment. See, the main point is improvements in production don't affect the possibilities for employment in the economy as a whole. Often, they will result in less people having to be employed in the industry in which the improvements occur, in which case more people will be employed elsewhere. Sometimes they make it possible for what would otherwise have been a small industry to become a much bigger one, and then more people are employed in that industry, but fewer people are then employed in other industries. So it really doesn't matter. There's nothing that depends on the improvement having to benefit the industry in which it occurs. It generally will benefit the particular company which introduces it, but at the very same time, reduce the profits of its competitors. Mr. Valiant.
In the improvement in a single industry, for that improvement to spread out in the economy, it seems very critical that it's a free market, that prices and wages fall easily. Isn't that, if there are any obstacles to wages falling, doesn't that spread of the benefit become more difficult?
Yes, that's a very good question. In order for the greatest benefit to be achieved and for the short-term problems to be minimized, the freer the economy, the better. You see, if you look at our potato growers, if the rest of the economic system is wide open to free competition, if there are no restrictions on the employment of people in the whole rest of the economy, well, then the potato grower says, well, this is unfortunate, I have to go find another job. But the whole rest of the system is open to him. His problems will not be too great. Suppose now, though, that major areas are unionized, or they have licensing requirements, or there's a minimum wage law or whatever. Now, the possibility of relocating is made much more difficult. The short-run negative effects of the improvement are made a lot more severe than they need to be. So for this to really work smoothly, we want a free economy. And the problem is the less free the economy, people look at the consequences of the violation of economic freedom, and they think, well, that's why they need more violations. The potato growers will never think of asking for freedom in the rest of the economy. They'll say, well, we've got to stop the improvement in potato growing. Yes, sir.
I was wondering what the improvement to the average income of Americans, at least partial capitalism, has brought in the last 100 years. For instance, you mentioned earlier, I think, that the average income today of Americans is $20,000 a year. Press in 1885, do you have any idea what it might have meant in relative same spending power?
Well, I could give you some number. I don't know how accurate it would be. Instead of looking at the dollar numbers, see, the dollars that the statisticians will come up with are really not that accurate. They cannot allow for quality changes. All you have to do is look at it this way. In 1885, the average worker perhaps was working 60 hours a week. What could he buy with the money that he made for 60 hours a week? Now, could he have a home with indoor plumbing? Did it have a television set, air conditioning, central heating? Did he have an automobile, a telephone, on and on? Well, ask yourself, how much does the average person work today? And what is he able to buy with the wages he earns? And I think we can agree that the improvement is stupendous. And I think one can say without exaggeration that the average person in the United States lives at a higher material level than Queen Victoria did, or Julius Caesar, or Napoleon.
The reason I asked that question, I was wondering what you would have to earn today to be living at the average standard of a person 100 years from now.
Well, that's hard to predict, but if we had 100 years of capitalism, well, it would be conceivable that, this is just a rough statement, maybe the average income would be equivalent to $100,000 or $150,000 a year, and people perhaps could have the hours of a college professor. Well, thank you very much. I think we